Hello, I'm Miles O'Brien. Welcome to another edition of Miles to Go. When I was young, one of my favorite must-see TV shows was Flipper, the story of the Atlantic bottlenose dolphin, who always seemed to save the day in the nick of time. Now that I know more about dolphin intelligence and social structure, as I look back on that show, I realize how cruel it really was to force the dolphins that played Flipper, and there were more than one, mostly female. It was cruel to make them work so hard for their food. Be that as it may, I always wished I could one day swim with dolphins. Not captive dolphins. That too, in my view, is cruel. When Denise Herzing was growing up in Minnesota about the same time, she thought the same thing. But instead of discarding the thought in favor of other pursuits, in my case it turned out to be journalism, Denise remained focused like a laser beam on understanding dolphins. And she has committed her career to doing just that. It eventually led her to Florida and the establishment of the Wild Dolphin Project. 34 years later, she has achieved great insight into the previously secret lives of spotted dolphins, and she's working on ways to understand them literally. What do the clicks and whistles and all those noises really mean? My cousin is a famous underwater photographer, Ruth Petzold, and she's an old friend of Denise's. She serves on the board of Denise's foundation. Last month, Ruthie booked some space on Denise's research vessel, the Stenella, and invited me to tag along. It was a life-changing experience. I sat down for an interview with Denise after our amazing 9-day voyage. This was field season 34, trip number 3 or 4? What was it?
3.
So 34.3. How was that typical, unusual, or, put this in the broader context, what we did?
Sure. So you were out on the 3rd trip of our 34th field season. And I would say it's a pretty typical trip. Weather was decent, but a little tropical stormy. We had some days without dolphins completely, but then we had great dolphins some of the other days. We saw some terrific behavior, actually. Some sound and behavior, courtship behavior, mating behavior, and repeat animals. So I'm sure you recognized a few in the water by the end of the week.
It's kind of amazing to me that you just happen upon the same group. They find you, you find them, whatever. You've figured out how to connect, haven't you, over the years?
Well, the dolphins are resident in that area, and in any given 10-day period, for example, they're probably feeding in the same area or interacting in the same area. That can shift, but we're lucky that we get repetitive sightings.
Just give us a few words, because we began on the ear missions. Tell us about the ears and what they're all about, and what you hope to gather, what kind of data you hope to gather off of those.
So this year we did something new. We deployed some passive acoustic listening devices called ears, ecological acoustic recorders. And basically they sit on the bottom. They record, in our case, 30 seconds every 5 minutes for a month. And then we pick them up, we download the data, we put them back. And the idea is that they're listening while we aren't there. So we can go through the data and see what sounds are there, figure out what species went by. And it gives us a way to find animals that aren't easily findable anymore in certain areas. And we can go back and maybe try to find them.
Find an individual animal, a type of animal? I mean, would you be able to identify by a whistle, for example, that kind of thing? How do you know what you're hearing?
Well, first and foremost, the ears are used to just show the presence of dolphins. So echolocation clicks, whistles. So the data will show us there were whistles and clicks recorded on June 1st at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So we know some dolphins were there. Then we can go through the data and maybe pull out the species. And if we're lucky, we could match signature whistles if we have them on file. But the idea is that we want to know when they're there, when we aren't there, so we can find them more readily in the future.
Is this the first time you've been able to, put a security camera, if you will, on the dolphins and monitor them when you're not present?
This technology is not something we've used because our focus is to find them in the water, get underwater footage, correlate sound and behavior, and try to figure out their lives. These devices are used more in murky water environments, places that it's difficult for researchers to get, so they leave recording devices. It's just new for us because the animals have changed their locations. And so we just want to get a handle on where they are when we're not there.
Deciding where to put these devices is obviously a big part of the art and science of this. Are there dolphin corridors or dolphin interstates? And was this where you intended to put these?
We put the devices where we had regularly interacted with dolphins in the past, but we weren't seeing them the last few years. So that's the idea. In fact, the first time we deployed the first ear, the dolphins showed up, so I guess it's a good place. That was pretty funny.
They're like checking out your work.
Like, yeah, hey, we're here, sure.
This was in the area where you spent a lot of time seeing a lot of the individuals we ended up seeing further south in Bimini. This was their home for a long time, right? Do we know a little bit about why they moved, and is that part of what this is? Is that one of the questions you're hoping to answer?
The dolphins had been basically resident for 28 years. We could go out, and it's, you know, there are sandbanks in the Bahamas, right? And so they have access to all this food on the deep water edge. So it appeared that they made their home on the Little Bahama Bank in this case. In 2013, we went out there and we were missing half of our dolphins, which is a little disconcerting. You know, you don't know if orcas have come through, if there's Navy sonar involved, whatever. So we did find them 100 miles away, but we were wondering, why would you leave your home after 28 years of a stable place? So we started looking at oceanographic data, and we'd kind of noticed that the fish had kind of disappeared, and we thought, you know, maybe there was something going on with the environment or climate change. So after looking at a NOAA database that records a lot of different things, one of them was surface chlorophyll, which is a proxy for plankton. We saw clearly there was a significant drop over the years, which probably relates to the fish crash. So our best guess right now is that the fish and squid just disappeared and they had to go somewhere else to feed.
Interesting, but you really had to do quite a bit of sleuthing to figure that out, didn't you?
Yeah, but you know, we compared different areas. You know, and other areas did not have this chlorophyll reduction. It was just the area where the dolphins fished in this certain way, and it was pretty clear something happened there. Now, it'll also be interesting to see if it comes back and if we can predict it with the data from NOAA. So,
best you can tell, would this be a natural cycle, or do we know if there's some other cause?
We really don't know what causes chlorophyll drops in our case. The science tells us that it would be lack of sunlight, which is hard to believe in the Bahamas, right? The other is nutrient cycles. And nutrient cycles can be driven by upwelling, different winds blowing nutrients on and off the sandbank. And the other thing that has actually shifted out there is the wind direction, probably because of climate change and changing jet streams and fronts coming in and out. And so winds that are normally southeast in the summer were coming from the west or southwest, which really changes the tidal flow on and off the sandbank. So we suspect it was probably the nutrient circulation that just got disturbed for, you know, probably climatic changes.
I keep stumbling in on just about every story I run into, these kind of unintended, unforeseen consequences of climate change that you really wouldn't think about. You talk about the knee bone connected to the thigh bone stuff. You know, it's amazing how everything is related, right?
All right, yeah, and they can be subtle changes and very localized changes. But now it's impacted the lives of, in this case, 50 dolphins that left, and now those dolphins are trying to integrate with a local pod in this new area. So now you've got all these behavioral things going on, and now you've got added pressure on this other dolphin group. So it gets really complicated for the animals.
It's kind of a micro version of the macro scene for the planet. If you start extrapolating that out, you realize this is why climate change is so potentially cataclysmic when you have all these things happening.
Yeah, it is cataclysmic, and unless you have a long-term project where you know the baseline and you can see the change, a lot of these changes will actually go undetected.
Just a couple more things on the ear. What are the big questions you hope to answer with the ear? What's on your mind, and what do you hope to garner from it? Or is it just you're just fishing for data and see what happens and try to mesh that with your other data?
Yeah, the big questions with the ears are really, when do the dolphins come by these locations? It doesn't give you a long stream of audio, and it certainly is not giving us video. It's really about when they show up in these locations so we can find them.
Just another little piece of the puzzle, probably a small piece of data.
Another little technology.
Little data point.
It's another little piece of data just from some new technology that we hope will add to our abilities to find the dolphins.
Okay, so a viewer at home is going, well, why don't you put a tracking device on these dolphins, Denise? What's the matter with you? You know, I'm sure you've considered a lot of, and I know some researchers do this, either tracking devices, cameras, etc. What's your philosophy on doing that kind of thing?
So the Bahamas is one of the few places in the world where you can observe animals underwater. That's why I chose the location. That's how we've worked. And one of the basic principles we work with is behaving ourselves in the water with the dolphins. And our motto is in their world on their terms. If we started grabbing them, putting them on our boat, drilling a hole through their dorsal fin with a satellite tracker, I'm pretty sure they would not come around the boat and let us watch their behavior. So it could give us really interesting information. And of course, many researchers use it in cases where they want to analyze habitat, distribution, where the animals go. In our case, because they're resident and we're shooting for underwater behavior and sound, we just don't do it.
But it's like a trade-off, right? I mean, I'm sure if you could figure out a way to do it, you'd love to have that kind of data, right?
Sure, science is always a trade-off. If, in the future, like technology goes, there'll probably be some development. I mean, there are already suction tags you can put on animals that would just, annoy them, but it probably wouldn't hurt them. But they only stay on for a day or two. Does that give you enough information? I don't know. Then how many do you tag, right? Do you tag 2 juveniles, or do you tag, a bunch of adults and the juveniles and get the whole picture? So it becomes a question of what data are you trying to get. So we just feel like it's more valuable to be non-invasive, have the animals trust, let them show us their society underwater.
You did mention a key point which I think we need to get across here, that how special this particular part of the world is to do what you do. You've got clear water, shallow depths, et cetera. Just walk us through why this is the ideal, kind of natural laboratory.
Right. So most places in the world, researchers work from the surface because, number one, the water is murky. Sometimes it's just simply dangerous, whether it's wave action, sharks, who knows. But you can't see underwater most places in the world. You're pretty limited to the tropics. The species we work with is also fairly gregarious. They seem to have, I wouldn't say an easy life, but they have pretty good access to resources historically, so it probably gives them more playtime. And we've habituated them over the years for our presence in the water and try to behave ourselves so that they show us their natural behavior, whether it's foraging, fighting, mating, all those things.
So you've had a long time interest in the natural world, and in particular the sea world. When did it become evident to you this was the place?
Well, I had actually done my graduate work in captivity. I worked in the San Francisco area at a facility trying to correlate sound and behavior, and you get a certain amount from captivity, but I didn't like the environment for the animals. It's quite unnatural. It's an artifact. Their social structure is an artifact, and I just set my sights on finding a place in the wild where I could observe their society and tell the story of wild dolphins. I also had the luxury I saw the primate researchers like Jane Goodall, Diane Fossey, and even Cynthia Moss with elephants plant themselves in a non-human animal society and let the animals show them their world. This involved tracking individuals, taking notes, and taking data, but eventually a picture emerged that you could get no other way. So I thought, why hasn't anybody done that with dolphins, And I luckily ran into a place that had already been discovered by treasure divers where there were friendly dolphins, and I went out there just to see if it would be a good research site and figured I'd invest 20 years and try to get through a few generations of dolphins and tell the story, and here we are 34 years later.
So you just show up and say, oh yeah, I'll give it 20.
That's what I wanted to do.
You big better in the casinos? The captivity versus wild component. You've had the opportunity to study dolphins in both environments. Is it like night and day? Is it different data? Are the dolphins behaving completely differently, or is it just subtle?
I think most scientists would agree that there are things you can do in the wild you can't do in captivity, and vice versa. In captivity, you have experimental control. You can ask certain questions. But if you're looking for natural behavior or societal relationships, you're only going to find that in the wild. So I think that's really the restrictive point. And, remembering that we have to think about what's good for the animals, too.
It's interesting to me how when you make the commitment to study an animal in the wild, it's like in each case that you mentioned of your templates, it's a long run. You can't. It's not just going to happen on your terms. It's their terms, like you say, right? So you have to be a long-run scientist, right?
Right. I mean, there's such value in long-term research, whether it's baseline to note changes or it's just going through a generation. For example, when I first got out there, it was all new to me. I mean, I knew something about dolphin behavior, but seeing it in the wild and seeing how mothers and calves act with their, how courtship goes, you'd get a glimpse, but then it's like a generation later, you go, oh, they kind of do the same things, but there's some subtle differences because they're individuals. So a mother might have a different mothering style, or one mother might discipline a calf by holding them down on the bottom. The other might flip up on the surface and hold a calf out of the air. So same goal, just different ways of doing things.
This kind of work doesn't lend itself well to the academic structure of research that we have created, where you have to crank out papers, do proposals, and have results quickly to get the next pot of money. Is it difficult to get funding to do this kind of research?
Well, we put out papers as soon as we had enough data, but yeah, you need enough data. But remembering that the quality of the paper also matters. So some papers end up being really seminal studies because they're 10 years of data or 20 years of data, and they stand the test of time for baseline information. Funding is always hard to get, whether you're working in the academic scenario or going elsewhere for your money. It's pretty critical, of course, to be able to stay out there and do the work, but it's always difficult.
I mean, scientists are always hand to mouth. Is it hard to keep this thing going?
Yeah, it's very hard to keep a project going. I mean, funding, number one, is always the dance. You want stability. I used to joke with my board of directors that, if we don't have enough money, we should be out there in a rowboat at least getting photo ID, because if you lose track of the individual in one season, you stand to potentially lose them in your catalog, and it's all about the individual and tracking them.
So you sort of created this thing where you just got to keep going. You can't stop.
Jane Goodall didn't even see the fighting and the warlike stuff until 40 years. It takes a while for things to emerge. And so the investment, it's worthwhile to keep going.
Jane Goodall, Dian Fossey, don't take this the wrong way, but relative to you, they had it easy, right? I mean, at least they could be breathing air all day, right? Explain the differences of what it's like to go after, to take that approach for something that lives underwater.
Right. Well, I guess when you're studying mammals terrestrially, yeah, you're more in your own habitat, number one. Well, you still have to trek through jungles and mud and, still have to collect data in different situations, and you have dangerous things. So we all kind of do the same thing. The difference probably in our work is we have to go out and float on a boat, and then we have to find the dolphins, which again is typical. We have to be in the water. Collecting data is different because you can't just ride on an underwater pad, at least with dolphins, they're so quick. So you have to use media like video cameras, hydrophones. And then you have to come out of the water and then take your data, at least what you saw, and then transfer it. So, it's different in some ways. I don't know that it's honestly that different. It's just that it's in the water. So you're restricted to human challenges.
There is a little higher bar to get over to get the data you need, I think. That's
well, I think
objectively true, probably.
It's definitely not easy, but it is what it is. So to get that data, that's what you do. You go out, you spend a lot of time waiting and looking, and then when the opportunity is there, you go for it. Like in our field season, sometimes we might get a quarter of our data within 2 trips, and the rest is kind of dribbles of catch-up things. So it really depends on the weather. But again, it's field work everywhere is kind of like that. You could go sit on the Arctic ice and wait for 3 months for a bowhead whale to go by, and they might not ever go by. You're not in the water in that case. But
would you describe it as hard work, or is this fun adventure, or both?
It's totally hard work. It's about 95% hard work. We just don't run out there in the summer and do the work. We prep all year. We have to get equipment together. We have to make sure the boat is working and ready. We're doing data analysis all winter, detective work to verify our data or check on things. Then we have to write grants for funding, and you go out there, and yeah, when we're in the water, it's hard work because you're not just pointing a video camera, you're watching who to track and follow and whose fecal material do we need because we don't have that, so we can determine paternity, and your mind is rolling a lot in the water, and then you come out and you log the data, and then at 9 o'clock at night, you turn on the video and you log that at night. So yeah, of course it's hard work. It's a beautiful place to work. And of course you see really cool things, but it's hot, you get sunburnt, you're salty all the time. But again, that is field work, whether it's in ice or in heat. It's dealing with the elements.
You've devoted your career, really your life, to this. Have you ever had regrets about it?
No, I have no regrets. I want to keep going. The body changes. But we've got the young ones. They're like, they're up to par. I trust they can get the data when I'm not out there. And it's all about trying to keep it going.
I watched you interact with both Cassie and Leah, and you're a good mentor and a good teacher. How important is that to you to kind of pass along this, this passion and this interest to a new generation? I'm
not sure you can pass along passion. You can identify it, perhaps. can certainly try to encourage it, but I think passion is with the individual, But certainly, well, they're trained. They're graduate students usually that are out there with me. They're trained in the technique. They know what works, and hopefully they're open to bringing new things to the field and putting their own flavor on it. I mean, of course it's important. And again, they're in the generation where there's emerging technology, emerging methods, so that's their future. And hopefully the dolphins will stick around.
When last we left our dolphins, they were leaving the Little Bahama Bank, headed to the Grand Bahama Bank. And this is somebody else's turf. What has transpired as that move has occurred, and what have you been able to observe as they moved into an area where a lot of bottlenose dolphins are, et cetera, et cetera? What's gone on?
So the first year we found our resident dolphins in this new area with other currently resident dolphins. Again, we're observing and tracking how they integrate or don't integrate. So after about a 3-year period, we did an analysis of the data, and at first it looked like they were integrating, but then not so much. Now, what's emerged, it's been, 5 years, it looks like some of them have joined forces. For example, some of our males from the north are now hanging out with the males in this existing group, so they formed other alliances, which is pretty interesting. Mothers and calves still seem to stay separate, but they're still in their kind of clusters, so they maintain their relationships for the most part. But you've always got outliers and different things, and maybe this is how their genetics gets mixed up and diversified.
This is coalitions of both bottlenose and spotted males will come together.
So
or are we talking all spotted here?
We're talking all spotted. Male spotted dolphins typically hang out in coalitions or alliances of 3 to 4 dolphins, and it's usually a lifelong friendship. But what happened during this move, some of the northern males, for some reason, have integrated with some of the new male dolphins there, and they seem to be hanging out together. So that's kind of the first time we've seen that, although we haven't had the opportunity to see it because they were always in their home turf.
Just a couple of words on the bottlenose versus spotted. Most people think of dolphins, whether it's SeaWorld or the aquarium or a flipper, it's a bottlenose dolphin. These are spotted dolphins. Tell us the difference.
So bottlenose dolphins are the dolphins most of us are exposed to, partly because they're in marine parks, but they're also coastal animals. That's probably why they ended up in marine parks. Atlantic spotted dolphins, the ones we work with, really are unstudied. We really knew nothing about that species, so we've been able to contribute to that. Now, a dolphin is not a dolphin is not a dolphin. So things we know about bottlenose dolphins may or may not be true with other species, and there's about 30 other species. So we have to be careful when we analyze our data to not assume that every dolphin is going to be like a bottlenose dolphin.
They are a little smaller, and they are a little more approachable. And
So in the world, there are a few places where there are sociable dolphins, and they're usually bottlenose dolphins, but they're usually individuals. Out in the Bahamas, it's kind of the opposite. The spotted dolphins seem to be the more tolerant, friendly, curious dolphins, and the bottlenose are a little less tolerant and standoffish. We're not sure why. Could be their social structure. I suspect it's also because they were captured many decades ago quite heavily in the area we work, and they may just have a bad memory of boats or humans, that sort of thing. Their species temperament is quite different.
are they more aggressive? Are they, what is it?
So bottlenose are about 3 feet larger than the spotteds, and it's been our observations that they're either traveling or eating, so they probably have to spend a lot more time hunting and digging for food than the spotted dolphins. Their social structure is also a bit different than the spotteds. It's still basic. They still have mother-calf relationships, but they tend to be a little more aggressive within their own society, and that flows over when they're interacting with spotted dolphins. They tend to bully and harass and beat up the spotteds sometimes, honestly.
The spotteds tend to stay away from bottlenose?
The spotted's reaction to dealing with the bottlenose in those kinds of aggressive situations is they form larger coalitions. So you have, we joke about the ratio, it takes about 6 spotteds to fend off a bottlenose. So they have a coordinated strategy. They form one large organism by, joining forces, and then they'll be able to chase a bottlenose away usually. But, that's, they share territory. They live in the same environment. They don't compete for food. We think they're actually competing for females, turns out, because there is interspecies mating. That is a whole interesting question for communication, too, right? So we have the behavior and sounds of spotted dolphins, and then we have bottlenose dolphins interacting with the spotted. So how much do they share? Sounds, behavior. I mean, they're kind of dolphins, so they have the same body shape and the same anatomy, but do they understand each other? Do they learn each other's signals to interact? These are the big questions that we don't know.
I want to talk about language in a sec, but one more thing
Yeah.
on bottlenose. Would you make the argument that because they have to do more hunting, that's why they're less available for you to interact with? Is that part of it, you think?
Yes, bottlenose, they spend all their time surviving, I think, basically. It's not unlike a human culture. If you have a lot of resources, you develop art and, you have more social time. If you're always hunting and gathering, that's what you do.
And in the case of spotted, they can play with a scarf or seaweed or whatever, and they can indulge themselves in that.
Yeah, spotteds have more free time. They are able to feed themselves quicker. Their social structure is similar in the sense that they still have 4 to 5 years as teenagers and kids, so they learn the social rules, but it's a little easier, I think, because they're pretty well fed.
I mean, watching them on the bow of the Stonella, you get the sense that they're just doing it for the pure joy of it.
Sure, the ocean is a fun place. They're the original surfers. They surf on large whales. The large whales push a bow wave ahead and they get a ride sometimes. So it's a fun way to develop your bonds, right?
How many animals, outside of humans, have the luxury of playing around, goofing around?
A lot of mammals play. And again, if you look at it functionally, it's a way to learn the rules without being in danger, right? So you're in the play mode, so you can bully and tussle with each other, but you haven't learned the lines yet, but it's not a harmful situation because it's play. Same with dogs, same with cats. I think a lot of mammals use that to develop their adult skills.
People have been studying dolphin communication for quite some time. Most of it has been, oddly, as humans would be, trying to teach dolphins to speak English or whatever, right?
Right.
Or human language, let's say. But there's obviously something going on there. Is it communication? Is it echolocation? Or is it potentially a language? What's the correct term?
So we don't usually use language when we describe dolphin communication because language has really specific things that we include. And we haven't proven that dolphins or any other species really has those. Things like structure to their sounds or whatever their communication signals are, order, symbolic reference. We don't know if they talk out of time, displacement about yesterday or the future. Now, some experiments have been done in captivity with dolphins and dolphin communication to suggest that they have the ability to understand human-created artificial languages. So if you teach a dolphin something like visual sign language or an acoustic language, they seem to be able to comprehend it. So they have the flexibility. We just don't know if they have it in their own communication system.
And this is obviously on your list, pretty high on your list at the moment, right? Trying to figure this out.
Some people will say, oh, it's been looked at and it's been done and no one's found anything. My view on it is, number one, we haven't really correlated sound with other behavior. Like, I'm speaking right now, but I put my hands in the motion and my voice gets intense and there's all these other signals that give you the complexity of interpreting what I'm saying, and then I'm going to interact with someone and now you see a dynamic. So we haven't had that information on dolphins. We also haven't had, I think, the adequate tools to look at if language is embedded in their sound per se. So now we have AI, we have machine learning, we have computers that can, they still need human help, but they can pull out patterns to look if there's order and structure at least to these sound types. Then you move into to have a language, you have to have some structure. We know that much. Now you have to interpret it. So how do you interpret it? Maybe you have to do experiments to interpret it, but you can also have things like metadata. So, for example, if we're recording a conversation with dolphins squawking and squeaking at each other, we usually know who's there, we know their relationship, we know if they're males or females, we know if it's the mother or the calf. So we have it's kind of an anthropological perspective on the society to be able to understand how they use maybe those structures and sequences. But that's a whole other level. So that's kind of the next step. Once we get some detail to the order and structure of their sounds, then we can start trying to interpret it, if at all possible.
What you're talking about is the context of the communication to understand what might be communicated, right? But you and I are having a conversation now, and if you looked at the video, you'd have no idea what we're talking about, right?
That's correct.
So is it possible they're talking about Donald Trump or some, random thing that has nothing to do with the seaweed or the fish or the humans there?
Sure. There's going to be communication about what's going on real time. Let's chase the fish, so I'm using my echolocation clicks. That's the tool I use. I don't have a fishing rod, but I have my sound to dig out a fish. But then there's what are they talking about? Sure, if you put a microphone at a human dinner table, you wouldn't be talking about the food most of the time, You'd have munching sounds and swallowing sounds and clinking glasses, but talking about what you did yesterday or what you want to do next week with the kids, that sort of thing. So there's sound correlated with behavior, that's real-time action. Then there's what's called context-free grammar, which the same sounds or sound sequences could be produced in different contexts, so it's not dependent on if they're fishing. So that's kind of what you're looking for, are things outside of context. We want to know both because we do both. You know, we're going to talk about what we're eating, but we also want to talk about other things.
So the idea that as a start though, to be able to take 34 seasons worth of video, put it into artificial intelligence program, pattern recognition, machine learning, at the end of the day, you're going to come up with what? What do you hope to get out of that, you think?
I hope the first thing we'll get out of our machine learning work is, number one, categories of sounds that are hard for humans to categorize, that might just be blowing past us, right? So the computer can do that kind of stuff. Then we're going to look at the order of those categories of sounds to see if there's any grammar to them. Then you take those sequences and you go back to the underwater video, try to match them either with what's going on, with certain individuals, with certain relationships, and then you do your best to interpret it. You know, whether we'll get to really understand if it's language or not, I don't know. That's, we could play back sequences, for example. You'd probably have to do some experimental work to really confirm its language. That's my guess.
Do you have the sense that what we're hearing is the core, or is there something, you're able to see stuff that the human ear can't detect? Is there a whole other layer that we're not hearing with the ear?
Well, there's a lot of sounds they make within our hearing. However, when we use our high-frequency recording equipment, we see components of those audible sounds up in the higher frequency ranges. So we're certainly missing those with our ears, but we have the tools to record them. We also see indications of modulations of sound that could be some of the detail of what they're communicating within the higher frequencies. I mean, the reality is their best hearing is in the higher frequencies, so that's probably where they're going to put most of their information or energy. Other animals often have obvious communication signals with each other, but if there's a predator around, they also can switch into a stealth mode of communication. So somehow they know that that predator can't hear them or see them or whatever their communication mode is, and so they'll go into a secret mode with each other. So again, these are the things we just don't know about dolphins, but we're looking.
What's the next step in this research? Are you still kind of crunching all the video and the audio and matching it all up? Is that the process where you are right now?
Yeah, I mean, we always do our basic stuff, field work, who's there, what new spots they have, do they have new calves, who are they hanging out with, and genetics. That's the basic profile of the society work. And then we continue to get sound and behavior samples and high frequency. But right now, yeah, we've got 34-year database. We're putting it all into some really cool pattern recognition exercises. We're still kind of going through the exercise, though. What works best? What can we find from there? That's probably our focus for the next 10 years, really, is to mine that data and try to make sense of it.
Oh, we're talking decadal, though. This is that much work.
Oh, yeah. Well, and the tools are going to evolve, and look at how much they've evolved in the last 10 years. I mean, I wanted these tools 20 years ago, but they weren't around. But the data's there, so you can always exercise the data 20 years later.
And this is all about your collaboration with Georgia Tech and THAAD and everything else, and Google and et cetera. So when we saw you last, one of the holy grail ideas is this box. Just walk us through a few of the challenges of trying to use the box as an interpreter, as it were.
Well, I mean, there are two different ways we study their communication signals. Most of the time, we're just trying to decode. That means recording signals, processing them, looking at the patterns, and try to interpret. A second approach we've been trying, which is a little trickier, but it became obvious that it might be a creative way to interact with the animals, is to try to do some two-way interface. So this has been tried over the decades with limited success and challenging tools. It's analogous to using a keyboard with a primate. So basically what you're doing is creating some artificial symbol, you're matching it with a sound or an object, and you're trying to explore together with the other species what it means. So if you and I were different species, and I had my little coffee cup here, and I said, hoo-hoo, am I labeling this cup? Am I saying, would you like a drink? There's all these things. So you want to model the system. I'd ask somebody else or show them what the word for cup is in my language. And then maybe you start a dialogue because you can both say the word for cup in the same way. So the idea with the chat system, which are basically computers we wear in the water that have a very limited repertoire of artificial sounds that represent objects that the dolphins like to play with. So we model with each other. So I have one or two other researchers with the same computer system on their body, and we'll ask each other for the objects using that system. And they're simple whistles, and they're probably easily mimicable by the dolphins. But we're showing them what it gets them. If they make a whistle for the sound, we'll offer them a toy, or we'll exchange a toy. It's not really training them, it's modeling what is available to them with this system. And the hope is that, and they've done this in captivity at quite a few different species, they can learn pretty readily to attach a sound type to an object and can use it fairly functionally. You know, we know African gray parrots can do this, we know primates can do this, bonobos and common chimps. So it's not too far-fetched to think dolphins might do this. Now, whether wild dolphins want to do it or not, that's a whole other question, because they have quite an interesting world without us. They're not sitting at a tank looking for entertainment and human interaction. So we try to use what I call our windows of opportunities, where they're just playing with us. We try not to disturb their natural behavior when we have this system in the water, but we're trying to use windows where they're dragging a piece of sargassum, and we can label it acoustically while they're doing that. We can offer it to them. We can ask them to give us the sargassum. But it's challenging. Talk about challenging. You need to be working with the same individual dolphins. You need repeated exposures. This is why it's hard. I mean, a sanctuary system would be great. You'd have animals that maybe had time, they were in kind of a restricted environment, but that's going to be their life, and maybe they'd still be interested in working with humans. So you might be able to exercise that system differently in a different scenario.
Yeah, I think the challenges of doing this in the wild are immense. You know,
But you know what's really cool is that, yeah, it's challenging, but we had actually quite a lot of time with a small group of individuals. Science, often you find things you weren't expecting, right? And so sure enough, even though we didn't have a lot of back and forth with the system like we had hoped, what we found embedded in the data, specifically the high-frequency data, is a way that they were mimicking the signals that we had no idea they could even do. That, to me, is like kind of a little, not a Rosetta Stone, but a little indicator that maybe there's some other stuff in our data we haven't been looking at because we kind of didn't know that it existed. So in some ways, the tool of the two-way work has shown us how they prefer to communicate. Maybe they didn't get the system or whatever. So now we're going to go back and look at our regular observational data and say, maybe they've been saying this stuff all the time in other ways. So
you just weren't looking in the right place, maybe? Or?
Yeah, basically, yep. That to me is like really valuable.
But building this box, there's a lot of technological, that's a tough challenge on its own right now, in addition to the aspect of finding the individuals, teaching them, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, the technology, honestly, it's still really not good enough. It's just a matter of, we're not cabled to the boat. We don't have Wi-Fi. We don't have all the power and the storage and the amplification. We have to wear everything because we're mobily swimming with the animals. So that's a whole other dance. If we were cabled to the boat and could just work there and have the computer behind us, that'd be great. So it's all about, mobility, modularity, smallness, but power. So it's been challenging for sure. Just
to finish that up, though, do you have the sense that in the span of your career, do you anticipate that there'll be a breakthrough on this, that there'll be some... or is that impossible to predict?
I think we'll have breakthroughs in the sense of getting more details out of what they're saying. It might be for the next generation to take it to the next level with some other technology or analysis procedure. I'd be happy if we got to the point of finding grammar and structure in their sounds and having a way to mine large data sets. Because that's half the challenge. There are scientists that spend 30 years analyzing by hand animal sounds, and the computers can do it with a little help, more easily.
Walk through a couple of the interesting things we saw together. We saw mating rituals, right?
Yeah, this last week in the Bahamas was all about courtship and mating, which happens. It's kind of pulsated. It's a peak mating time. Basically, the ritual of mating involves a female that's probably an estrus, and somehow the males sense it, probably chemically in the water is my guess, or maybe through sound if they're scanning her. But clearly she's the object of interest. The males, now remember they're in coalitions of 2, 3, sometimes 4, and they're going to either monopolize her from other males, or in a larger group they're just going to try to buzz her, get close to her. We often see them inverted upside down as, 1 or 2 of them, trying to get access to her. If the female's cooperative or interested, they'll eventually get underneath her and they'll mate. It's pretty quick. And they'll take turns sometimes. They're not monogamous, of course, but They'll take turns mating to get access to her. And it goes on and on and on. And whoever's the lucky guy gets to have a little offspring. Also, what we saw were juvenile groups doing that same kind of thing. And remembering that they're really not sexually mature at that point. The females get mature about 9 or 10, but the males take another 5 years to get mature. So there's a lot of practicing too, right? Learning to dance. It's just, I'm sure it's fun, but it's also practical in the sense that they're learning their patterns, their habits, they're getting used to each other in this whole process. So we saw a lot of that and a lot of sounds that go with it. Yeah.
Dolphins have sex for fun?
Dolphins have sex for fun, thus proving they're intelligent.
We actually saw like the high school prom or something, or the car afterwards, I guess, or whatever. Yeah. Anyway, all right. So
did everybody do that?
we had a brief encounter with bottlenose. That was a little different experience in a lot of ways. We talked a little bit about bottlenose, but we saw them feeding in a little different way. You want to talk a little bit about that?
We saw the bottlenose dolphins doing different behaviors, including feeding. And although all the dolphins on the sandbank feed in the bottom to a certain extent, the bottlenose, they're going for really deeply buried conger eels. Usually they're fatty fish. It's probably a lot of caloric value for the bigger bottlenose. So we saw them doing a thing called crater feeding. And you probably heard there's a razor buzz. It's basically echolocation clicks, but it actually sounds like an electrical razor. So the bottlenose scan on the bottom, just constantly they're going along, clicking, clicking, clicking on the bottom. And as soon as they either see some movement or a hole where the fish is living, they dig down and they really dig deep, pushing up sand. Sometimes you see it coming out of their mouth. And they finally get a conger eel and they'll pull it out and eat it. And then they'll do that again. And on the bottom, we see all those different crater marks. We call it crater feeding because it leaves crater marks because the sand's kind of crusty and it just is the way they dig. So it looks like the moonscape. We can always tell if they're crater feeding there.
I imagine dolphins just kind of swimming through and catching fish on the fly. It's not how it works, is it? Yeah.
Well, sandbank is a unique environment.
Yeah. All right, so any other behaviors that worth mentioning that we witnessed? Those are the two biggies. What else did we see?
Some of the pretty obvious things we saw were dolphins making their signature whistles. So a signature whistle is a type of frequency modulated whistle that's unique to an individual. They're basically like names. So they're broadcasting their identity, or one dolphin can call the other really by its name. We also saw a version of that we call an excitement vocalization. And that usually happens when the calves, or sometimes juveniles or adults, they get really excited and they kind of lose control of their motor system. They're excited to see you, so they'll swim around in a circle. And it has partial components of a signature whistle, but it's like, and they just it's excited. They're excited to see you. And that's what they also do when they're being rowdy and the mother has to discipline them as they're trying to get them under control, probably because it brings in predators or something.
Do they get excited when they see you?
I sure hope so.
Do they do like, do they do that?
Yeah, I mean, they recognize us. They recognize the boat. Yeah, I think so.
How would you describe your relationship with them? Is it a friendship, a bond? Is it what is it? What it's among species, interspecies? How do you describe that?
Well, we're probably the migrants. We're seasonal migrants. We go out in the summer to study them. I think we're kind of like social companions. Pretty pathetic in the water, but we try to be social companions. I think they're just curious. I think intelligence recognizes other intelligence, and curiosity is a component of not only exploring your environment, being intelligent about it. I think they're curious about other living things in the water, and they know us. They probably recognize us by how we swim or what we look like, or maybe by sound. But yeah, I think they're curious about us. I think they have fun with us, and they kind of ignore us sometimes when they're doing their behavior. So that's really what you want. You want them to be comfortable, but do their own thing.
You do get the sense as they swim by you that they're really checking you out. Is that me projecting, or are they really kind of?
No, they're really checking you out, and they get to know the subtleties pretty quick. How you swim, probably what you're carrying. We're always pointing cameras at them, so they're probably like, "What's that thing?" They're really curious when we show them things too. If you drop the fin in the water, they'd be like, "Oh my gosh, you lost your tail." And they're great. They're great mimickers. I mean, we have some hilarious footage of, a person trying to mimic a dolphin kicking and then a dolphin behind that person kind of jerkily swimming. So I guess they have a sense of humor. I don't know.
Making fun of the human.
Yeah, they use mimicry in their own system. That's how they learn and interact. So for them, it's kind of natural. That's really why we actually started the two-way system, is they were mimicking us and looked like trying to communicate. So we were like, let's give them a tool. Maybe it could go somewhere.
So if you could talk to them,
What would you say? I don't know anymore. I think I'd love to know just kind of what's important to them. I'm guessing it's relationship and social stuff. I'm sure they have great stories about shark encounters in the deep ocean and all that stuff. But what it's like to be a dolphin would be kind of neat. So we try to get as close as we can.
Thank you, Denise. And thank you for dedicating your life and your career to such an interesting and worthwhile pursuit. I hope you crack the communication code soon. And I hope when you do, you tell the dolphins, we're sorry about how we treated their cousins, and we hope to do better in the future. All of this will be the subject of a TV story coming up on the PBS NewsHour. I'll let you know when that's coming down the pike. We've got a few other things in the pipeline for now. And if you want to know always what we're up to, I invite you to go to our website, milesobrien.com, and sign up for our newsletter. Once a week, you'll get a summary of science news, some of the interesting stories that caught our attention, and you'll hear and see what we've been up to as well. If you enjoyed this podcast, do us a favor, rate and review it. We're just kind of poking along here, putting this out, seeing if anybody is interested. And the more you say how you feel about it, the better chance we get of getting a little more traction and a few more listeners. Thanks again for listening. I'm Miles O'Brien, and this has been Miles to Go.